Hello and welcome to this video on the story of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was a conflict that took place from 1955 to 1975 between North Vietnam and South Vietnam, with the involvement of the United States and other countries. It was a complex and controversial war that had a significant impact on the world. In this video, we'll provide an overview of the key events, factors, and consequences of the Vietnam War. Background and causes. The Vietnam War was a prolonged conflict that began in the 1950s and lasted for 2 decades. The roots of the conflict can be traced back to the struggle for independence of Vietnam from French colonial rule. The First Indochina War, which lasted from 1946 to 1954, was fought between the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, and the French colonial forces. The Viet Minh succeeded in gaining independence for Vietnam, but the country was divided into 2 parts, the Communist North and the Anti-Communist South. The division of Vietnam led to political instability and tensions between the 2 sides. In the late 1950s, the Communist government of North Vietnam began supporting communist insurgents in the South, known as the Viet Cong. The United States became involved in the conflict in 1961, providing military aid and advisors to the South Vietnamese government. The Cold War tensions between the U.S. and Soviet Union played a significant role in the Vietnam War. The U.S. was committed to containing the spread of communism and viewed Vietnam as a battleground in the larger Cold War conflict. The U.S. involvement in Vietnam was fueled by Cold War tensions between the U.S. and Soviet Union. The U.S. saw Vietnam as a key battleground in the fight against communism and believed that if South Vietnam fell to the communists, it would lead to a domino effect in Southeast Asia. U.S. involvement and escalation. The U.S. became involved in the Vietnam War in the early 1960s as part of its Cold War strategy to prevent the spread of communism. The U.S. initially provided military advisors to the South Vietnamese government, but as the conflict escalated, the U.S. began deploying troops in large numbers. By 1968, over 500,000 U.S. soldiers were stationed in Vietnam. The conflict quickly escalated, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The U.S. used increasingly destructive tactics such as bombing campaigns, including Operation Rolling Thunder, which involved sustained aerial bombardment of North Vietnam. The U.S. also used the toxic herbicide Agent Orange to destroy crops and defoliate forests, which caused long-term health problems for both Vietnamese civilians and American veterans. The war was fought in difficult terrain, including dense jungles and swamps, which made it challenging for both sides. Despite the U.S. military presence and increased firepower, the conflict remained a stalemate. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces were able to adapt and fight a guerrilla war, using hit-and-run tactics and hiding among the civilian population. Turning point of the war. The turning point in this war became the Tet Offensive, that was a series of surprise attacks launched by the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong on the South Vietnamese cities during the Tet Lunar New Year holiday in 1968. The offensive was a strategic gamble by the North Vietnamese Army to strike a decisive blow against the South Vietnamese Army and to create a popular uprising against the U.S.-backed government in South Vietnam. The attacks targeted major cities in South Vietnam, including the capital Saigon, and caught the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces off guard. The initial wave of attacks was successful, with the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces briefly occupying parts of the cities. However, the offensive was ultimately a military failure, with the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces quickly regaining control of the cities. Despite the military failure of the offensive, it was a turning point in the Vietnam War. The scale and intensity of the attacks, which took place during a holiday truce, shocked the American public and undermined their support for the war. The role of public protests in ending the war. The public protests against the war in Vietnam were a major factor in the eventual end of the conflict. As the war continued, more and more Americans became disillusioned with the government's policies and actions in Vietnam. Starting in the mid-1960s, protests began to increase in size and frequency. Initially, they were largely organized by college students and anti-war activists, but they soon spread to include a wide range of Americans from all walks of life. The protests took many forms, including sit-ins, rallies, marches, and even violent clashes with police. One of the most significant protests was the moratorium to end the war in Vietnam, which was held on October 15, 1969. It was a nationwide demonstration against the war and saw millions of people participate in rallies and marches across the country. The protests had a significant impact on public opinion, with polls showing that the majority of Americans opposed the war by the early 1970s. This pressure on the government to end the war was one of the factors that led to the Nixon administration's decision to begin negotiations with the North Vietnamese. In addition, the protests helped to increase awareness of the war's human toll, both on American soldiers and on the Vietnamese people. The media coverage of protests and the war's atrocities, such as the My Lai massacre, further swayed public opinion against the war. In conclusion, the public protests against the war in Vietnam played a crucial role in ending the conflict. They helped to galvanize public opinion against the war, increase awareness of its human cost, and ultimately pressure the government to withdraw from the conflict. Legacy and impact. The Vietnam War had a significant impact on the United States and the world as a whole. It was the first war that was widely televised, and it brought the horrors of war directly into American homes. As a result, public opinion about the war turned against the U.S. government. Many Americans saw the war as unwinnable and immoral, leading to widespread protests and anti-war movements. The war also led to a rethinking of American foreign policy, with many people calling for a more cautious approach to military intervention. The Vietnam War was also a military defeat for the United States. Despite the massive investment of troops and resources, the U.S. was unable to achieve its objectives in Vietnam. This defeat had a lasting impact on American military strategy and doctrine, leading to a greater emphasis on technology and air power in future conflicts. The legacy of the Vietnam War was also felt in Vietnam itself. The country suffered from the effects of the war for decades, with many areas still contaminated by unexploded ordnance and Agent Orange. The war also had a profound impact on Vietnamese society, with many families torn apart by the conflict and a legacy of bitterness and resentment towards the U.S. Overall, the Vietnam War had a profound impact on the U.S. and the world, shaping public opinion about war and foreign policy for decades to come.